The cowboy who pulled me from the raging waters became the man who owned my soul. Jake Morrison saved my life when the flood took everything, but the letter my father left him revealed a debt that made me his property. What started as gratitude turned into a prison of obligation, and what felt like love became the cruelest kind of ownership. The same hands that rescued me from drowning held the papers that bound me to him forever. Subscribe to discover how salvation can become the deepest betrayal. The flood came without warning, turning our peaceful valley into a churning nightmare of mud and debris. I was clinging to a tree branch when Jake Morrison appeared through the chaos like some kind of guardian angel. His rope found me just as my strength gave out, and his strong arms pulled me onto his horse with a gentleness that contradicted his rugged appearance. The water had taken our house, our livestock, and everything we owned, but Jake's cabin became my sanctuary. He wrapped me in warm blankets and fed me hot soup while the storm raged outside. His kindness felt like a miracle after losing everything I had ever known. The way he looked at me made me feel safe for the first time since the water started rising. Jake never asked for anything in return during those first weeks of recovery. He gave me his own bed while he slept on the floor, and he shared his food without complaint. His hands were gentle when he tended to my injuries, and his voice was soft when he spoke about the future. I found myself watching him work around the cabin, admiring the way he moved with quiet confidence. The attraction between us grew slowly, like a flower blooming after a long winter. He made me feel beautiful, even when I had nothing but the clothes on my back. Those early days felt like falling in love with my own salvation. The other townspeople whispered about Jake's generosity, but their comments carried an edge I didn't understand. They spoke about him taking me in like it was some kind of business arrangement rather than simple human kindness. Mrs. Henderson from the general store gave me strange looks when Jake brought me to town for supplies. The way people stepped aside when we walked together made me feel like there was something they knew that I didn't. Jake always changed the subject when I asked about their reactions. His evasiveness should have been a warning, but I was too grateful to question my rescuer. The intimacy between us deepened as autumn turned to winter, and Jake's cabin became more than just shelter. His kisses tasted like coffee and promises, and his touch made me forget about everything I had lost. We made love by the firelight while snow fell outside, and I believed I had found something beautiful in the ashes of tragedy. He whispered my name like a prayer, and I gave him my heart without reservation. The way he held me afterward made me feel like I belonged somewhere again. I thought I had found my home in his arms, not knowing I was already trapped there. Jake started acting differently as winter deepened, becoming more possessive and controlling in ways that felt wrong. He didn't like me talking to other men in town, and he always had reasons why I shouldn't visit my few remaining friends. His protectiveness began to feel more like ownership, but I told myself it was just his way of caring. The questions I asked about our future together were met with vague answers and uncomfortable silences. He would disappear for hours without explanation, returning with a tension in his shoulders that he couldn't quite hide. Something was eating at him, and his guilt was starting to show in everything he did. The letter arrived on a cold February morning, delivered by Judge Crawford himself, rather than the usual mail carrier. Jake's face went white when he saw the official seal, and his hands shook as he broke it open. I watched him read it twice before his shoulders sagged in defeat, and I knew that whatever was written there would change everything between us. The way he looked at me afterward was different, like he was seeing me for the first time, or maybe the last time. He folded the letter carefully and put it in his pocket, but the damage was already done. The man who had saved me from drowning was about to let me drown in a completely different way. Judge Crawford's visit the next morning felt like a funeral before anyone had died. He sat at Jake's kitchen table with the letter spread out before him, his weathered face grave with the weight of legal obligation. The words he read aloud hit me like physical blows, each sentence stripping away another layer of the life I thought I understood. My father had borrowed money from Jake years before the flood, using me as collateral in a deal I never knew existed. The debt had never been repaid, and the flood that destroyed everything had activated the terms of their agreement. I wasn't Jake's girlfriend or his guest. I was his legal property until the debt was satisfied. The rescue that had felt like salvation was actually just Jake claiming what was already his. The amount my father owed was staggering. More money than I could earn in a lifetime of honest work. Jake had been supporting me not out of kindness, but out of legal obligation to protect his investment. Every meal he had shared, every gentle touch, every whispered endearment had been tainted by this hidden ownership. The love I thought we were building was actually just him managing his property with unusual care. My father had sold me to pay for his gambling debts, and Jake had been waiting for the right moment to collect. The flood had simply made the transaction convenient and given him a heroic cover story for what was essentially human trafficking. Jake couldn't meet my eyes as the judge explained the legal details of my servitude. The contract was ironclad, written in language that made me sound more like livestock than a human being. I could work off the debt through domestic service, but the interest rates made it nearly impossible to ever be free. Jake had the right to sell the debt to someone else, or to keep me indefinitely if he chose. The law was on his side, and Judge Crawford's presence made it clear that the authorities would enforce the agreement. My father's signature on the bottom of the page looked like a death warrant, written in familiar handwriting. The man who was supposed to protect me had instead delivered me into a kind of legal slavery. The worst part was seeing the genuine anguish in Jake's face as the truth came out between us. He had fallen in love with me just as I had fallen in love with him, but he had done it while knowing I belonged to him. His guilt over the deception was written in every line of his body, and his pain at hurting me was obviously real. But his feelings didn't change the facts of my situation or erase the months of lies between us. He had let me believe I was free, while knowing I was bound to him by law and debt. The tenderness he had shown me was real, but it was also the kindness of an owner to valuable property. Even his love was tainted by the power he held over my life. Judge Crawford left us alone to process the devastating revelation, but the silence between Jake and me felt heavier than words. Everything I thought I knew about our relationship had been built on a foundation of deception and legal coercion. The cabin that had felt like home now felt like a beautifully decorated prison cell. Jake's attempts to explain or apologize only made things worse, because what could he possibly say to justify what he had done? He had saved my life only to own it, and he had made me love him while knowing I had no choice but to stay. The rescue that had seemed like a miracle was actually the beginning of my captivity. The realization that I had been grateful to my own captor made me sick with shame and rage. I had thanked him for his kindness while he was simply taking care of his investment. Every moment of happiness we had shared was now poisoned by the knowledge of what lay beneath it. Jake Morrison had saved me from drowning in the flood, only to drown me in a sea of legal bondage and emotional manipulation. The cowboy who had seemed like my salvation had actually been my destruction all along. The letter my father left him had turned love into ownership and rescue into the cruelest kind of trap. Living with Jake after the truth came out felt like wearing beautiful chains that grew heavier each day. He tried to pretend nothing had changed between us, still bringing me coffee in the morning and speaking to me with the same gentle voice. But every kindness now felt calculated, every touch carried the weight of ownership, and every smile seemed designed to keep his property content. I found myself analyzing his every gesture, wondering what was genuine affection and what was simply good management of his investment. The love that had felt so natural now seemed forced and artificial, like a performance we were both trapped in. He was trying to be the same man who had rescued me, but I could no longer see him as anything other than the man who owned me. The other townspeople treated me differently once word of the arrangement spread through the community. Some looked at me with pity, others with a kind of knowing smugness that suggested they had suspected the truth all along. Mrs. Henderson at the general store spoke to me like I was a child who couldn't be trusted with adult decisions. The men tipped their hats with the careful politeness reserved for another man's property rather than an independent woman. Even the women who had once included me in their conversations now kept their distance, as if my situation might somehow be contagious. I had become a living reminder that women could still be bought and sold in ways that were perfectly legal. Jake's guilt manifested in increasingly desperate attempts to make me comfortable in my captivity. He bought me expensive dresses I had no occasion to wear and jewelry that felt more like shackles than adornment. His gifts were generous but hollow because we both knew they were given by an owner to his possession rather than by a lover to his beloved. He would watch my face hopefully when he presented each new offering, searching for some sign that his kindness might earn my forgiveness. But every gift only reminded me that he had the power to give or withhold everything in my life. The beautiful things he surrounded me with were just decorations for my cage. The physical intimacy between us became a complicated dance of desire and revulsion that left us both exhausted. My body still responded to his touch, despite my mind's rebellion, and the pleasure he could give me felt like another form of betrayal. He was gentle and patient, trying to coax back the passion we had shared before the truth destroyed everything between us. But every kiss tasted like ownership, and every caress felt like a claim being made on property he already possessed. I hated myself for still wanting him, and I hated him for making me want someone who had deceived me so completely. The bedroom became another battlefield where love and law fought for control of my heart. Jake started drinking more heavily as the months passed, and the distance between us grew wider despite our physical proximity. He would sit by the fire in the evenings, staring into the flames with the haunted expression of a man who had gotten everything he wanted only to discover it wasn't what he needed. His attempts at conversation became more stilted and desperate, as if he was trying to talk us back to the happiness we had shared before the letter changed everything. But there was no going back to innocence once the truth had been revealed. He had saved me from the flood, only to drown us both in the consequences of his deception. The guilt was eating him alive, but it wasn't enough to set me free. The worst moments came when Jake would forget about the legal arrangement between us and treat me like the woman he had fallen in love with rather than the property he owned. He would laugh at something I said or reach for my hand without thinking, and for a brief moment we would both remember what it felt like to be happy together. Then reality would crash back down on us, and the weight of what he had done would settle between us like a wall neither of us could climb. Those glimpses of what we might have been if he had been honest from the beginning were more painful than his worst moments of possessiveness. They showed us both exactly what his deception had cost us, and the price was higher than either of us could bear. The spring thaw brought more than just melting snow. It brought a traveling preacher who spoke about freedom and redemption in ways that made my captivity feel even more unbearable. Reverend Matthews held revival meetings in the town square, and his words about breaking chains and finding liberation resonated in my soul like church bells calling the faithful home. Jake forbade me from attending the meetings, but I could hear the singing and preaching from our cabin, and every hymn felt like a message meant specifically for me. The preacher spoke about how God could break any chain and free any prisoner, and I began to believe that maybe my situation wasn't as hopeless as it seemed. His presence in town was like a crack of light appearing in the wall of my prison. I started planning my escape with the desperate creativity of someone who had nothing left to lose. The debt that bound me to Jake was legal but not moral, and I began to believe that sometimes breaking unjust laws was the only way to serve true justice. I saved every penny I could find, hiding coins in places Jake would never think to look. I studied the train schedules and mapped out routes that would take me far from his reach. The planning gave me hope for the first time since Judge Crawford had read that terrible letter aloud. Every small preparation felt like an act of rebellion against the man who owned my body, but could never own my spirit. Jake sensed my growing restlessness and became more controlling in response, watching me more carefully and limiting my freedom even further. He started locking doors that had never been locked before and questioning me about every conversation I had in town. His paranoia was justified because I was indeed planning to betray his trust, but his increased vigilance only strengthened my resolve to escape. The cabin that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a fortress designed to keep me prisoner. He was so afraid of losing his property that he was destroying any chance of keeping my heart. His fear was turning him into exactly the kind of man I needed to run from. The confrontation came on a warm April evening when Jake found the money I'd been hiding and the train schedule I had copied from the station. His face went through a series of emotions, from hurt to anger to something that looked almost like relief that the pretense between us was finally over. He didn't shout or threaten, but his quiet disappointment was somehow worse than rage would have been. He asked me if I had ever loved him at all, and I couldn't answer because the truth was too complicated for simple words. I had loved the man I thought he was, but I couldn't love the man who owned me. The Jake who had rescued me from the flood was someone I could have spent my life with, but that man had never really existed. The night after he discovered my escape plans, Jake did something that surprised us both by offering to tear up the contract and set me free. He sat across from me at the kitchen table with the legal papers spread between us, his hands shaking as he reached for a match. But when the moment came to actually burn the documents, he hesitated, and I saw the war being fought in his eyes between love and possession. He wanted to free me, but he couldn't bear the thought of losing me, and the conflict was tearing him apart. In the end, he put the match down and folded the papers back up, choosing ownership over love and sealing both our fates. That moment of hesitation told me everything I needed to know about where I stood in his heart. The next morning brought news that would change everything once again, when a stranger rode into town claiming to have information about my father's death that would invalidate the contract entirely. Jake's face went white when he heard the man's story, and I saw something that looked like hope mixed with terror in his eyes. The cowboy who had saved me from the flood was about to discover that the letter my father left him might not be worth the paper it was written on. But by then, the damage between us had already been done, and some betrayals cut too deep to ever fully heal. The truth was coming whether we were ready for it or not. The stranger who rode into town turned out to be my father's brother, a man I had never met, but who carried proof that would shatter everything we thought we knew about the debt. Uncle Samuel had been searching for me since the flood, following a trail of legal documents and family secrets that led him to Jake's cabin. The papers he carried showed that my father had been coerced into signing the contract under threats of violence, making the entire agreement null and void under territorial law. Jake's face crumpled as he read the evidence, realizing that he had held me captive for months based on a document that had no legal standing. The foundation of his ownership had been built on fraud and intimidation, and now it was crumbling beneath his feet. The revelation that I had been free all along hit both of us like a physical blow that left us reeling. Jake had tortured himself with guilt over owning someone he loved, while I had endured months of captivity for a debt that didn't legally exist. We had both been prisoners of a lie that had destroyed any chance of real happiness between us. The irony was bitter and complete. We had lost each other over a contract that was worthless from the beginning. Uncle Samuel's arrival should have been a moment of celebration, but instead it felt like attending the funeral of what we might have been. The truth had set me free, but it had come too late to save us. Jake's attempts to apologize and explain felt hollow in the face of what we had both endured unnecessarily. He begged me to stay and try to rebuild what we had lost, promising that things would be different now that I was truly free to choose. But the months of deception and captivity had changed us both in ways that couldn't be undone by legal documents or heartfelt apologies. I had learned to live without trust, and he had learned to live with guilt, and neither of us knew how to go back to being the people who had fallen in love during those first weeks after the flood. The damage was too deep, and the scars too fresh for healing to be possible. The townspeople who had watched our strange arrangement with knowing looks now seemed embarrassed by their own complicity in what had turned out to be an injustice. Mrs. Henderson apologized for treating me like property, and Judge Crawford admitted he should have investigated the contract more thoroughly before enforcing it. Their belated recognition of my humanity felt like salt in wounds that were still bleeding. They had all been willing to accept my captivity when they thought it was legal, but now they wanted to pretend they had been on my side all along. Their shame was almost as hard to bear as their earlier indifference had been. I chose to leave with Uncle Samuel, not because I didn't love Jake anymore, but because I loved myself enough to walk away from a situation that had poisoned everything beautiful between us. Jake stood in the doorway of his cabin, watching me pack the few belongings that were truly mine, his face a mask of grief and regret. He didn't try to stop me or make promises he couldn't keep, because we both knew that some betrayals cut too deep for forgiveness. The cowboy who had saved me from the flood had also taught me that sometimes salvation means having the courage to save yourself. I left him standing there with his guilt in his empty cabin, finally free, but forever changed by what we had shared and lost. Years later, I would think about Jake Morrison and wonder if he ever found peace with what he had done to us both. The flood had taken everything I owned, but it had also washed away the illusions that might have kept me trapped in a life that wasn't really mine. Sometimes the greatest rescue is learning to save yourself from the people who claim to love you, but don't know how to set you free. The cowboy who saved me from drowning taught me the hardest lesson of all, that love without freedom is just another kind of prison, and sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from someone who can't love you the way you deserve to be loved.